So it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you, Nick, to speak to us on tomorrow's battlefields, U.S. proxy wars, and secret ops in Africa. Thank you.
I want to thank all of you for joining me today. You know, it's such a pleasure to be here, and to finally have a chance to discuss my work on the continent where it really matters most. And I especially want to thank the Afro-Middle East Center for making my book available here, for bringing me for the first time to South Africa, and for providing me the opportunity to speak with all of you tonight. I also want to thank the Concerned Africans Forum and the University of Johannesburg for hosting me tonight. So I thought that I'd begin my talk where I begin my book with a military ceremony that took place behind closed doors, a ceremony that neither you nor I was ever meant to see. And this ceremony, which you can see a screen grab of it here, it didn't take place on my home continent, nor yours, but it had and it still has grave implications for all of us. This ceremony took place on July 12th, 2013, when a group of elite U.S. military officers assembled on a stage in Stuttgart, Germany, in front of a humongous American flag, as you can see. Among them, Captain J. Dane Thorlifson, who is seated on the stage there. He was the outgoing commander at the time of a highly specialized and elite unit known as Naval Special Warfare Unit 10. And Captain Robert Smith, the man at the lectern there, who was the commanding officer of its parent unit, Naval Special Warfare Group 2. And before this the small crowd of military personnel, these men spoke about something that's rarely mentioned in public: secret U.S. military missions in Africa. By that summer, representatives of U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, the umbrella organization for all U.S. operations on the continent, had told me again and again that the U.S. military presence in Africa was small, episodic, and above all, that it was benign. And this has been the line from AFRICOM since it was founded in 2008. You know, nothing much of note, they insisted, was going on in Africa. But at this closed-door ceremony, before this select crowd of insiders, the officers on stage offered a starkly different picture of military operations. This is a quote. "The mission of Naval Special Warfare Unit 10 does not pause," Smith told the audience. "Forces are deploying as we speak down on the African continent. That mission does not stop." He added, "Some people like to think that Africa is our next ridgeline." And then he set his audience straight. "Africa," he said, "is our current ridgeline." Smith also described partnerships with African militaries across the continent, from Nigeria to Uganda to Somalia, while lauding the departing Commander Thorlifson's efforts. Quote, "He has led this fight with his own boots on the ground in Africa." And that's what Smith said. And that caught my attention, because it didn't sound like the standard AFRICOM line about a few troops conducting a handful of humanitarian operations. It sounded as if he was saying that America's most elite forces were at war in Africa. Then Thorlifson took to the lectern himself, and he offered an even more striking vision of operations. Reflecting on 2 years in command in Africa, Thorlifson discussed what he called the high tempo of operations, with personnel, quote, deployed 365 days a year, and he lauded his troops for successfully operating in what he called a complex battle space. Then he quoted his boss, Major General James Linder, who was then the commander of all Special Operations Forces in Africa. he told the crowd, quote, "General Linder has been saying that Africa is the battlefield of tomorrow today." And he followed, "I couldn't agree more. This new battlefield is exactly where we need to be today, and I expect we'll be for some time in the future." On hearing this, my ears perked up, because this closed-door ceremony corroborated exactly what my reporting had uncovered over the previous year. And it convinced me that I needed to keep digging into just what the U.S. military was doing, far from prying eyes, all across Africa. And Commander Thorleifson wasn't joking when he talked about the high tempo of operations. That tempo has also continued to grow since 2013. Back in 2008, when AFRICOM began operations, it inherited 172 missions, activities, and programs on the continent. This just offers you a look at the type of activities that often go on, this being U.S. Special Operations Forces training in Cameroon. By 2013, the combined total of all U.S. activities like this one reached 546, an average of more than one mission per day. In 2014, this number leapt to 674. In other words, U.S. troops were carrying out 2 operations, exercises, or activities, from drone strikes to counterinsurgency instruction, intelligence gathering to marksmanship training, somewhere on the continent every single day. And this represents an almost 300% jump in these types of operations and exercises. And most of all, military-to-military training activities like this one. So this has meant more troops on the ground, and as a result, more bases all over the continent. And with all these missions, bases, and troops has come a desire for more surveillance, carried out by drone aircraft and also the manned variety. The idea is to have an eye in the sky in as many places as possible, with the eventual goal of complete coverage over almost every corner of the continent. And you can see from this map, right at the top, there's a map on this secret document that I was able to obtain. And it shows some of the places where the U.S. military could cover in 2013 and where they want to cover in the future. This is just a closer look. Now, the current inability to fully cover the continent is encapsulated in a favorite term that the military uses right now. They call it the tyranny of distance. And this is a reference to the great lengths that aircraft must fly from their base to their target area. Surveillance flights are, of course, limited by fuel and, in the case of manned aircraft, the endurance of pilots. So one way that you can overcome this, of course, is by putting more bases in more places. And that's just what the U.S. military has done. It's constructed a network of at least 14 key airfields integral to surveillance all across the continent. And from this slide, you can see them dotting the map. In case you can't see the slide, these are or have been located in Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Niger, the Seychelles, Uganda, as well as in Djibouti, where the crown jewel of U.S. bases can be found. And that facility, Camp Lemonnier, was once a French Foreign Legion outpost. Today, you can still find French troops there, but the base is now overwhelmingly American. The camp has seen the number of U.S. personnel stationed there jump by about 450% since 2002. And over that same time span, it's also expanded from about 88 acres to nearly 600 acres. And it's seen more than $600 million US dollars already allocated or awarded for projects such as aircraft parking aprons, taxiways, and a major special operations compound that's just becoming active right about now. And in addition to this $600 million, an additional $1.2 billion in construction and improvements has also been planned for the future. For a variety of reasons, U.S. drones don't even fly out of Camp Lemonnier anymore. That's something I could talk a little bit about more later. All the drones have been moved to this site here, about 10 kilometers away. It's a less visible locale known as Chibeli Airfield, where the U.S. has flown missions against targets in both Africa and the Middle East. And this base has also grown at an astounding rate over a very short period of time. The buildup you see depicted here, beginning in the upper left-hand corner, that was in early 2013. You can see it's, or maybe you can't from this, but it's basically a tarmac and some shipping containers there. They really have increased their footprint at this base. And the Djiboutian facilities and the 12 other surveillance outposts are themselves just a fraction of the bases, camps, compounds, port facilities, fuel bunkers, and other sites that have popped up in at least 34 countries, pictured here, more than 60% of the nations on this continent. These include small outposts in Central African Republic, Chad, Kenya, Mali, Niger, the Seychelles, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda. There are also 15 so-called cooperative security locations, or CSLs, in places like Senegal, Ghana, and Gabon. The U.S. military also has access to locations in Algeria, Botswana, Namibia, Sao Tome and Principe, Sierra Leone, Tunisia, and Zambia, and fuel bunkers and port facilities in nations from Cote d'Ivoire to Mauritius. Now, the U.S. doesn't have a full-fledged base or even an outpost here in South Africa, but this country is nonetheless a key node in the U.S. network of bases. On July 25th, 2013, the U.S. military issued what they call a pre-solicitation for a contract. And you can see it here. And this contract was, once awarded, would provide for nearly 65,000 metric tons of marine gas oil to be delivered to U.S. ships. And when I found this document, I looked. It runs from 2014 to 2018. It listed 13 of what they call places of performance in Africa. And one of them reads, South Africa, Durban. This next document from 2014 shows that a contract was indeed awarded to a group called World Fuel Services Europe Limited to provide fuel for the U.S. military in Durban. And here's a photo of a U.S. guided missile destroyer docked in Durban. And that's hardly the extent of U.S. military contact with South Africa. The U.S. military regularly conducts training exercises with South Africa National Defense Force. And these next photos are just to give you an idea of some of the types of training that go on. Pistol marksmanship here, a meeting of some top officers. On the far left is the top U.S. commander at AFRICOM. And this is a military news slide showing some training activities that went on during something called Shared Accord, which is a regular exercise between the U.S. South African forces and other regional forces, as well as usually there are some European countries that join in as well. So I'm often asked why the U.S. has set its sights on Africa. As we all know, in the 19th century, the West saw Africa as a mysterious and dangerous place, a so-called dark continent. And today, the United States still sees danger in Africa. The U.S. military views the continent as a hotbed of instability, Islamic extremism, and transnational terrorism. But it wasn't always this way, and it actually hasn't been this way very long. In 2000, for example, a report that was prepared under the auspices of the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute examined what they call the African security environment. And while they noted the existence of internal separatist or rebel movements, as well as militias and what they called warlord armies, they made no mention of Islamic extremism or any major transnational terror threats. Even after 9/11, in early 2002, a senior Pentagon official carried out a briefing with journalists, and at that time they were trying to drum up this idea that Africa was an unstable place and a place of terrorist threat. And this official drew attention to Somali militants, basically a group that was a forerunner of al-Shabaab, several hundred members of it at the time. But when he was pressed by journalists, he admitted that even the most extreme members of this group, quote, really have not engaged in acts of terrorism outside of Somalia. So still in 2002, according to the Pentagon, there was no true transnational threat in their estimation. So fast forward 15 years, after untold billions of dollars have been spent on training, arming, and supporting militaries all over Africa, after a 300% increase in U.S. missions, after the creation of a base network consisting of about 60 sites all over the continent, after fighting a coalition war in Libya, after backing proxy forces in Somalia and Mali and Central African Republic, and the tri-border region where Nigeria, Cameroon, and Chad come together, after launching special ops raids and drone strikes in Libya and also in Somalia, the U.S. military now says the continent is rife with terror groups. Late this past summer, the current chief of U.S. Special Operations Forces in Africa, Brigadier General Donald Bolduc, said that by his estimation, there were nearly 50 transnational and transregional terror groups active on the continent today. Now, when I asked the Department of Defense, that is the Pentagon, who these groups were, they told me that they didn't know. And I tried to count them up myself, and if you take all the obvious ones, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Morabatan, you go through the entire list, it certainly doesn't add up to 47. I asked AFRICOM, they wouldn't respond to me. I asked Special Operations Command Africa, they also ignored my requests. And this is typical. For years, the U.S. military has attempted to deny me even basic information. So while U.S. taxpayers like myself are allowed, or pay for it all, we're not allowed to know what our money is being used for and what's being carried out in our names. And even more egregiously, the U.S. military has kept this information from people all across Africa, whose countries are being used to further supposed U.S. national security interests, very possibly to the detriment of their own country's interests. I see that I'm running a little short on time here. I want to leave plenty of room for discussion and Q&A, so I'll start wrapping up. And since I began this talk with a secret U.S. military ceremony, I'll end with another one. This one carried out at a U.S. air base in the United Arab Emirates. This ceremony took place on October 7th of 2015, and a group of military officers gathered to commemorate a year of warfare waged in secret from Africa. They were celebrating the fact that from November of 2014 until October of 2015, a unit known as the 60th Expeditionary Reconnaissance Squadron flew MQ-1 Predator drones, like the one you see right here, from Jebeli Airfield in Djibouti on secret missions in the Middle East. According to Major Tim Smith of the U.S. Air Force, he's the gentleman on the right with the big smile on his face. The unit executed, quote, combat flight operations in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, unquote. That is, as part of America's undeclared war on the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And here's a closer-up image of the one I showed before in miniature. I think in this one you can see a little bit better the drones that were involved in the very operations that they were celebrating at the ceremony. There's MQ-1 Predators and there's also MQ-9 Reapers on the runway there. By the beginning of October 2015, they announced at this meeting, drones flown out of Djibouti had logged more than 24,000 hours of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions, and were also, quote, responsible for the neutralization, and that's the U.S. military's term, of 69 enemy fighters, including 5 high-valued individuals. Now, I asked for some clarification on this, and they stuck to that there were 5 people that they considered of high value. They would not say anything about who these other 64 were, or even confirm what was said at the meeting, that they were enemy fighters. So at the time, the U.S. government hadn't revealed that it was flying these drone assassination missions from Africa against targets in Iraq and Syria. And shortly after I began asking questions about this ceremony, the Air Force removed all public information about the unit from its website. And this is something that I found again and again. The U.S. military doesn't want the public to know what it says behind closed doors, because what it says behind closed doors varies greatly from what they'll say publicly. Just last month, an AFRICOM official told reporters at the Pentagon that the only permanent location we have in Africa is Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti. They're just sticking to this. Everything else, he said, is a light footprint. And this has been the line of the command for years, as I said. In fact, at a Pentagon press conference in April of 2014, the AFRICOM commander, General David Rodriguez, swore that the United States had little forward presence on the continent. And to hear him speak, you would think that AFRICOM was hardly engaged in Africa. But just days earlier, I was the lone reporter who sat in on a gathering where a very different story was told. It was a group of military officers from AFRICOM who do the real building on the continent. It's the engineering staff. And they were speaking to representatives of some of the biggest military engineering firms on the planet. And this is a quote: "We have shifted our original intent of being a more congenial combatant command to an actual warfighting command." And this was Captain Rick Cook, who was at the time the chief of AFRICOM's engineering division, speaking to the contractors. And he was unequivocal. He said that the U.S. was, quote, at war on the continent. This is what I've been documenting for years. It's why I wrote Tomorrow's Battlefield, and why I've continued and will continue reporting on what AFRICOM clearly sees as a war in Africa. It remains to be seen, however, when or if AFRICOM will finally admit this to the American people, and most importantly to the peoples of Africa. When that is, they will tell all of us what right now they'll only say behind closed doors, that they're working to turn Africa into the battlefield of tomorrow by making it the battlefield of today. So thank you very much.